So if you're just joining us and haven't participated in our digital discussions before, basically the way it works is there will be a short 15, 20-minute presentation about the topic, in this case, Edsel Ford, son of Henry and Clara Ford, and we'll follow it up with about a 5 to 10-minute discussion. Hopefully I'll stir up some controversy and some good talking points, get you folks thinking, and hopefully not grasping pearls too much. But yeah, it's short, little informal 30-minute session, and you can use the chat feature. I will be able to see if you say anything in chat. So if I'm speaking too quickly, you can't understand me, if I'm not enunciating enough, just tell me in the chat. I won't be offended, trust me. But we'll go ahead and get started with our digital discussion for September 2nd, Edsel, the man and the machine. Now, he wasn't a cyborg. There's just the man and then also the later machine named after him. Now, he was the son of, as I said, Henry and Clara Ford, born in 1893. And he was born after 5 years of Henry and Clara's marriage. He is their only child, and he's basically with his father all the time. He rides in his father's famous 1896 quadricycle, Henry Ford's automobile. I don't think it would qualify as one today, but quite revolutionary at the time. He starts sketching automobiles and car designs in 1903, the same year his father actually starts his third car company, the Ford Motor Car Company. And he actually really much becomes obsessed with everything involving the automobile industry, everything from writing essays about them at high school, at Detroit University, a high school he attended, to working after school as a teenager. But as he becomes an adult, a bit of a melodramatic relationship develops with his father. The full scope of Henry Ford and Edsel Ford's relationship, that itself could be its talk on its own. We don't really know 100% their relationship. Most historians believe that their private discussions, both men took to the grave. But even in the public eye, you could see they had a bit of a combative relationship, a push and pull relationship. His father representing tradition and just bare bones, getting a car from A to B, and Edsel really pushing for style, pushing for progress, very progressive politics as well compared to his father. And Edsel, he really helps fix a lot of the company's problem. Henry Ford wasn't the best at managing this huge empire he had created, especially in terms of public relations, marketing. His father's bigotry and anti-Semitism, Edsel Ford would often have to clean up the mess his father had left in terms of abuses to unions, and he often has to go behind his father's back, much to his father's disapproval, further straining their relationship. Edsel had a very good relationship with his children, though, especially his wife, Eleanor. He marries Eleanor Clay, who happened to be a very wealthy woman, the daughter of Hudson's department store owner, J.L. Hudson, the niece, of J.L. Hudson. And Edsel spent a lot of time on the other side of Detroit with the rich and famous, you could say, where his father and mother lived on the other side of Detroit in Dearborn. Henry and Claire weren't too happy with their son hanging out with the wealthy. I guess they didn't consider themselves wealthy, even though they're some of the wealthiest individuals in the country. Edsel and Eleanor actually have a very good marriage. They have 4 children, Henry Ford II, Benson Ford, Josephine Clay Ford, and William Clay Ford, all now deceased. And they lived at this gorgeous home. Today it's the Eleanor and Edsel house, or the Edsel and Eleanor house, excuse me. If you haven't been, I highly recommend you visit. In my opinion, I have not been there, but just from their social media posts as well as their website, this home is gorgeous. It's so much more beautiful than Fair Lane. Fair Lane is a bunch of styles thrown together, and Edsel and Eleanor really took a lot of time designing their home at Grosse Pointe. I'll expand upon that a little bit later. Now, as a businessman, Edsel Ford, as I said earlier, he often had to clean up a lot of his father's messes, both in his father's poor management. But Edsel had every right to clean up his father's messes, considering he was involved with the company's leadership for several years. In 1915, he actually, instead of going to university or college, he actually heads out in 1915, stops going to college, and in 1915 becomes the company's secretary. 1919, he actually becomes the president of the Ford Motor Car Company. So Edsel is actually in charge, not his father after 1919. At least on paper, Edsel is in charge. In reality, no, it's Henry's way. There's not even a highway you can take. It's always Henry. Edsel was kind of given the title of president based on a scheme Henry Ford had worked up. In 1919, Henry Ford tried to get rid of shareholders. He wanted the family to run and own all things Ford Motor Car Company. So in 1919, he announced he was starting a rival car company that was going to sell cars at half the price of Ford Motor Car Company's Model T, and he was going to put his young son in charge of Ford Motor Car Company. As you might imagine, that caused quite a panic. Now, Henry Ford directs Edsel, who becomes instrumental in this scheme, to approach bankers and third-party dealers to buy stocks off Ford Motor Car Company shareholders. Then those shareholders would sell it, or third party, would sell those shares to Edsel. And when the dust settles, this rival car company Henry Ford was going to form never actually happens. And Edsel Ford and Henry Ford own a combined 97% of Ford Motor Car Company, with Clara Ford owning 3% of Ford Motor Car Company. Henry Ford owned the most of the 97%, Edsel only owning 41% of the company. Soon after the scheme to take over Ford Motor Car Company, which I don't think the FCC would appreciate today, Edsel Ford actually takes over Lincoln. Edsel Ford was, again, instrumental in negotiations with Lincoln, and in the process of purchasing Lincoln, which was then known as Lincoln Leland Motor Car Company, Edsel actually talked to a friend of his saying, "Father made the most popular car in the world. I would like to make the best car in the world." And I think that really captures Edsel Ford's idea of what it meant to be successful. Later on, seeing a need for a median market, the Ford was kind of an every person's car, the Lincoln, the luxury line. There's nothing really in between. They were losing customers to General Motors and Cadillac, for example. So they actually developed the Mercury line for that in-between market. And then in the later part of his life, Edsel instrumental in actually saving Ford Motor Car Company, not only from negotiating with unions and United Auto Workers, but also securing the life and business-saving war contracts to build the B-24 Liberators at the Willow Run factory. More can be read in the Arsenal of Democracy book, an excellent book if you folks are interested in the home front of the Second World War. Excuse me. Now, as a designer, Edsel Ford not only developed Mercury, he also developed the Model T's successor, the Model A. Now, the photograph in the top left is our Model A, our 1929 Model A sedan in that sandstorm brown color. And I see very curvy, not as rigid as the Model T. And actually, the later Model T's curve, especially in its fenders, that's Edsel. He really wanted a car that people could be proud of owning and something they could look stylish in owning. So you can see the Model A a lot more stylish than the very A to B car the Model T was. Next to the Model A on the top is actually an early Lincoln, the Lincoln Zephyr, 1936. Of course, 1936, not the best time to buy a brand new car. Great Depression is in full swing. The car below the Model A is the Lincoln Zephyr. It looks sort of like a VW Bug in my opinion. So a very compact Lincoln vehicle, the one on the bottom left. And that Lincoln Zephyr, that comes out in 1936 to probably moderate success. Now on the top right is actually Edsel Ford's personal Speedster, Now, this 1934 Speedster, which is actually owned by the Edsel and Eleanor Museum, beautiful car, just gorgeous. Never goes in production, just a vehicle that Edsel Ford designed himself. They actually have 3 other cars I couldn't find public domain images of, but you can see just the beauty and the style and the respect Edsel Ford went into designing these cars. And the last vehicle, the bottom right, is a 1942 Lincoln Continental, part of that first generation of Lincolns in the war and just after post-war period. Edsel Ford actually designs the first concept cars of the Lincoln in the late 1930s. I couldn't find a picture of the early concept car that Edsel Ford had designed that was in the public domain, but the 1942 Lincoln at the bottom right is a good idea of the style of the vehicle, which even prompted Frank Lloyd Wright to say, the most beautiful car in the world. So pretty high praise from the famous architect and designer Frank Lloyd Wright. In 1936, Edsel Ford, not just stylish in driving, but also very stylish in appearance, in dress. He was actually declared the best dressed businessman and actually the best dressed American man in the United States by a group of New York City tailors. He was called the Beau Brummel of Wall Street, who was a Regency English lord. Now, to give you an idea of how amazing it was for Edsel Ford to be named the best dressed man in the country, Fred Astaire, he was number 8. So that should give you an idea of how flamboyant and dapper Edsel Ford was in his appearance. If Fred Astaire is number 8 and Edsel's number 1. The artist. Now, this is actually from our collection. You have visited our museum. In the Into the Wild exhibit, you'll find some of these photographs on display, and also a photo album. Now, this is personally my favorite artifact, really showing the relationship not only between Henry Ford and the Edison family, but also the friendship between Edsel Ford and the Edison family. On the bottom right here, this should be the bottom left, you'll see a camera, which is a period piece replica of a camera Edsel Ford would have taken on the famous 1914 camping trip into Big Cypress Swamp, the Everglades. And that brown book is actually a photo album containing all these original photographs you see surrounding the screen that Edsel Ford took of the other party members. So it's thanks to Edsel Ford that we have all these wonderful photographs of the camping trip in 1914. But he took these photographs and he actually compiled them into a photo album he gave to Thomas Edison as a present. So we're very fortunate to have this very important artifact that Edsel Ford made. And he was an amateur photographer, painter, sculptor. He just loved the natural fulfillment that the arts gave. He was taking art classes and painting classes even shortly before his death. He was an early collector of African art, and actually what is today most of the Detroit Institute of Art's African art collection was originally Edsel Ford's collection that is donated upon his death. The home, as I said earlier, that beautiful home in Grosse Pointe, they had the landscaping done by Yen Jensen, one of the most famous American landscape artists. The home was built and designed by the architect Albert Kahn, and the interiors Walter Teague. Walter Teague basically is the father of modern industrial design. And the home had various Degas and Van Goghs, and of course, the patron of Diego Rivera was Edsel Ford. So you'll find numerous Diego Rivera works originally in the Grosse Pointe home. All of these fine works of art in the African art, as I said, donated to the Detroit Institute of Art, DIA. So you'll have to check it out if you're ever in Detroit. Now, as I said, Edsel Ford donated a lot of his works to the DIA. He was actually a trustee of the museum, and during the Great Depression, when the museum risked closure, Edsel Ford stepped up and paid the salary of all the employees of the Detroit Institute of Art to ensure that this museum would remain open to the public. And Edsel Ford, sharing a lot of beliefs with Diego Rivera in terms of the arts, not as extreme as Diego Rivera in terms of political thought, but Public art, very important to Edsel Ford. And you'll see in the photograph is actually the famous mural, or one of the famous murals that Diego Rivera designs at the Detroit Institute of Art. When it opened, 16,000 people showed up to see this giant mural. Many other trustees worried about this turning into a place for hoodlums and loiterers to gather. But Edsel Ford really defends the work and actually pretty much saves the work and supports more public arts to be installed throughout Detroit and elsewhere. At his death, the 41% of the Ford Motor Car Company stock actually goes to the Ford Foundation, which continues a lot of charitable work still today. Now, sadly, Edsel Ford suffers a grave passing. He dies in 1943 due to stomach cancer. The first quote you see on the screen is a quote from Henry Ford's grandson, Edsel Ford's son, Henry Ford II, who eventually takes over the company in 1944, shortly after his father's death. And a very bombastic and emotional quote from Henry Ford II, quote, "My grandfather killed my father in my mind. I know he died of cancer, but it was because of what my father did to him." As I said, a very contentious, some would say even emotionally abusive relationship Henry Ford had on Edsel. Shortly after Edsel's death, Henry Ford shattered because the death was sudden to Henry Ford. Whenever Edsel was undergoing treatment for cancer of the stomach, only he and his wife Eleanor knew. It doesn't come to public light or even that to his father's attention until Edsel collapses at work one day. Unsuccessful surgeries of his stomach fail, and Edsel Ford does pass away. Afterwards, Henry Ford's just shattered, as anyone would be, of course, after losing a child, especially their only child. Henry Ford famously asked his chief security, Harry Bennett, if he was unfair or cruel to Edsel. And he was told by Harry Bennett, not cruel, just unfair. If it was me, I would have gotten mad. Henry Ford saying, that's what I wanted him to do, get mad. So you can see a lot of the root of the poor relationship Henry and Edsel had during their melodramatic relationship. They just saw the world in different ways. His father was very strict and you have to stand up for yourself and fight. Edsel Ford, more caring, more progressive, get more flies with honey approach, basically, than you can with a closed fist in Henry Ford and especially Harry Bennett's chief security's opinion. Now we come to the car, the machine. On screen is an early 1958 Edsel. The front end, especially controversial to consumers. And the Edsel, as you see in the years 1957 to 1959, designed well after Edsel's death. It was actually a bit of a brainchild between some high Ford executives and higher level people throughout Mercury and Lincoln. They really worked together. And Henry Ford II, of course, very supporting of a car named after his father, who designed, the Model A, the early Continentals, and all these beautiful cars. However, the Edsel is a flop, one of the biggest flops, and sadly, a bit of overshadowing of Edsel Ford's legacy. The New York Times sums it up best, I think. The Edsel was a classic case of the wrong car for the wrong market at the wrong time. It was also a prime example of limitations of market research with its, quote, in-depth interviews, end quote, and, quote, motivational, end quote, mumbo jumbo. You see, basically, the car was designed by committee. They wanted to have a sturdy, strong American car with the stylings and sleekness of a European model. So you have this wide body, one of the widest cars on the market at the time, and also one of the longest cars at the time. It was a good 3 inches longer than the Lincoln Continental. But as you see, they try to have that very sleek, small radiator in the front with this big, wide body. It was just unbalanced, not proportional. They tried to put too many ideas into it, basically. They predicted the Edsel would sell 200,000 models a year. But between September 1957 and November 1959, only about 2 years and 2 months, they sell 149,000 in total. Today, they're very popular because of their rarity and a very unique time capsule of the late 1950s. So sadly, Edsel Ford a bit overshadowed from the failed marketing of the Edsel car, but in actuality had nothing to do with the Edsel. The only connection is that they both worked at the same company, basically. So we come to our discussions. And again, you can tap in the quote any thoughts or opinions, but I do have some artifacts if you're while you're typing or thinking of something controversial and exciting to say, really throw me off my game. This top photograph is actually a book, and I do apologize, the top of it's been cut off, but the top of it says, to Thomas Alva Edison and guest, October 21st, 1929. And it's a beautiful blue bound book. And in the interior fold, you'll see that bottom quote, not quote, but signature, to Carolyn and Charles Edison from Eleanor Ford and Edsel Ford, October 9th, 1930. This book was actually given to Charles Edison, again, seeing that connection between Edsel Ford and the Edison family. It was actually given during the famous Golden Jubilee, the 50th anniversary of Thomas Edison's invention of the light bulb, which occurred at Dearborn at the Henry Ford Museum. But there are some photographs, or not photographs, discussion question. So was Edison an artist for designing cars? If so, why aren't industrial designers, especially those that might still be designing, or those still designing cars today, not recognized as artists? Why aren't fine art museums just showing sketches of Edsel Ford's early cars? Why aren't they showing industrial designs and schematics? The closest thing I can see as a well-recognized industrial design being that of Diego Rivera in his focus on industry and the power of individuals. Oh, got a question. Who is running the company now, and how long did Edsel's son run the company? I don't know how long Henry Ford II ran the company, but the company is now in public hands. It's no longer in control of the Ford family. It's owned by various people. The Ford Motor Car Company, a publicly traded company, starting in the 1960s and 70s. So a long time it's been out of the hands of the family, but of course the Ford Foundation still having a large share of the company, as well as Minnie Ford and their descendants, a lot of Clay descendants as well. I think it was a History Channel that had a series showing the abusive relationship between Henry and Edsel. Have you seen that, and how do you feel is accurate? I haven't seen that series between Henry and Edsel, but I'll definitely add it to my list, and I'll get back to you if I see it. I worked at Ford on the finance side for 1973, and Henry Ford was still the boss, going strong. So yes, excuse me, the 1970s, pardon me, not the 1960s. And actually he was designed in a very famous movie you folks might have seen, Ford vs. Ferrari. I haven't seen that one either. I don't get out much. And you can hear that movie just from other visitors at the Edison Ford. It paints a very honest and frank depiction of Henry Ford II, from which it appears Henry Ford II inherited more of his grandfather than his father's management styles, if you know what I'm saying. Very oil, not honey approach. And then the last one, was Henry Ford to blame for his son's death? Very controversial, I know. It seems as though Henry Ford, somewhat, how much we don't know, at some point Henry Ford did blame himself for his son's death. As you saw from that bombastic and very emotional quote, Henry Ford does blame his grandfather. But of course, Henry Ford and Henry Ford II, very emotional and very bombastic men in their own right. Those weren't the only bombastic quotes they ever said, trust me. So one author that I read for this research actually said it wasn't so much Henry Ford and the abusive relationship they may have had, but it was more actually the stress of Henry Edsel Ford working with the military and working with the government, securing war contracts and building those B-24 Liberators. Edsel Ford does die in 1943, so that's right at the height of really the mobilization in the Second World War. So it might have been that added stress of the Great Depression and now the Second World War. And maybe by that point, Henry had gotten used to his father. I know it's a bit of a cold thing to think about, but this author argued that it was actually the stress of the war and the military and just general business than it ever was a personal relationship or even professional relationship to his father, which played to a much lesser extent. The book, The Filter Dome, describes Henry Ford's rise of power in the auto industry, not a very flattering view of him or his policies. Yeah, I agree. It's been a real transformation just in terms of how we interpret people, especially famous individuals, but it actually develops a great way, Henry Ford and others in the past, they were glorified, gods amongst men. But today we're seeing that these supposed gods, these very famous and influential Americans, influential individuals, they have their flaws, just like me and you folks. In fact, Madeline has a famous quote about her father, Thomas Edison, that she doesn't like most of the autobiographies coming out shortly after her father, Thomas Edison's death, saying that it didn't paint her father in an accurate light. It made him seem above men or above human. So we have to remember that a lot of those unflattering portrayals of famous individuals who did a lot of good things, a very honest portrayal as well, showing that good people can do bad things and bad people can do good things. So we always have to look at everything and, of course, imagine our place in history and their place in history and all the factors around it. So it makes history a little bit more exciting these days. Henry Ford resigned in CEO in 1979 and chairman in 1980. So yes, we keep going in ages. But yeah, today it's not owned by the family anymore. And as we're actually wrapping it up, unless there's any more questions, I have a challenge for you folks. This is exciting. Little activity if you want to try your own creative streak. Try to draw your own high concept automobile, something like the Lincoln Zephyr or the first generation Continentals, or maybe even the Model A or Edsel's Speedster car. So maybe draw your own concept car, express yourself. You can paint, you can draw, use pastels, really embrace that spirit of Edsel Ford as an artist, as a designer. And you can post it on social media and tag us, and we'll share it. There's no prize. It's just something fun to do. So if you folks are stuck at home, or if it's too hot to go outside, or if you're too far away to visit us in person, you can fill in that spirit by drawing your own vehicle, or take a photography class, take an art class, and think of Edsel Ford while you're doing it. But are there any last minute questions? Oh, one just popped in. I believe the Ford family still has a significant influence, yes they do, in the Ford management through special voting rights for their shares. Yeah, they actually do have some special privileges, as well as the Clays, whom the Fords married into, yes. But they don't own the whole company. They don't have 100% like Henry Ford would have wanted, probably still today if he was still alive. All right, well, if there aren't any questions, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining us for another digital discussion. Join us September 16th for our next digital discussions on the servants, the domestic staff of the Edisons and the Fords, especially those that came with them while wintering in Fort Myers. So I look forward to you joining us for these future digital discussions. As a reminder, they're every other Wednesday. So I'll see you all in 2 weeks. Have a great day.